Hey, it's Beyond the Session, the show where you get to hear what your therapist says when you walk out of the room. Our best friend, ChatGPT, says, "Ever wish you could read your therapist's mind? Now you can with our exclusive podcast." Today, we're talking about addiction, which is often misunderstood. A lot of times, we think about addiction as a moral failure or someone's lack of willpower, but it's a lot more complex than that. So we're hoping to unpack that a little bit and talk about the different ways that we can become addicted, the neuroscience behind it, how people get addicted, why they stay addicted, and the connection between mental health and addiction. So this is actually a two-part series. In the first episode, we're going to talk about the neuroscience of addiction. And then in the second episode, we're going to talk about treatment of addiction. How can people overcome their addiction? What are some success stories of people breaking free from it and having life beyond it? So let's jump in. I've got Lindsay Tsang with me today. He's a registered psychotherapist and the owner of Reset Counseling and Psychotherapy. Lindsay, I think our listeners probably have a lot of feelings about addiction. They may have seen a family member become addicted. They may be thinking about people that they saw on the street who are, very involved in the substance use. They might be thinking about cultural or societal attitudes that they've experienced through media, right? Through social media or on TV. They might think about the politics of how we address people who are deeply addicted. So I guess my question is, what's your overall broad approach to addiction? How can people frame this as an illness and as something that can get better?
I think if you look at the core mechanism of addiction, then it would look really similar across the board for different types of addictions, right? I mean, really what it is you have mostly a dopamine reward cycle that's happening. And so I think one of my favorite illustrations of this is a little cartoon of a bird. If you've never seen it before, it was popular for a little while. It's just a bird that finds a yellow drop on the ground, sucks it up, and then gets this euphoric feeling from it. So it floats up into the sky and comes back down. And then it walks along and it looks for the next yellow drop. And for every time it sucks it up, the high is not as high anymore. And it's starting to land on its butt or it's starting to hurt itself. And you can see it getting hurt. But it's getting more and more desperate and running to find the next yellow drop. And I find that this is a really powerful illustration of the cycle, because you get this, whatever it is, because it could be a substance, but anything that gives you a dopamine rush can become addictive. And that's almost anything that has any form of pleasure. So you get this little rush, and then it immediately resets the cycle for you to say, well, I must now look for the next hit of it.
Can you talk to me about what dopamine actually means? I feel like we throw that word around and maybe we don't understand it.
Well, you're really bringing me back to grade 11, 12 biology. Honestly, I really don't remember a lot of stuff anymore. But if you look at the brain, I mean, not just the brain, right, but the nerve system, you have at the end of these nerves, there are all these connection points between the nerves, and between them, there are these transmitters. They call it neurotransmitters. So they're little everything that happens in your body is chemistry, right? And so you have these little components that are interacting between the two sides. And so dopamine is just one of those that signal pleasure. So when you have a release of dopamine, it's your brain saying, or that system saying, this is pleasurable.
Right. So it's literally just good feels.
Yeah.
Okay. So then talk to me about the neuroscience a little bit more. Our brain's desire for reward or for that dopamine hit.
What happens is and they call this a cycle because I had a release, so my brain's already looking for the next release, right? It's looking, so it's a buildup, and then that's where people feel that I guess the temptation, right? They're saying like, oh, I have all this built up things, that this need to release that again. And so what happens with addiction, and this is how you know someone's addicted, because you can actually see the neural pathways change in their brains. Like the brain scans, you can see that the prefrontal cortex part of the brain, which is your impulse control part of your brain, starts working less and less. Like they're not as active when it comes to that same behavioral cycle. And so that's when we can really, call someone, clinically addicted, is when you can see that the brain has now changed according to the behavior. And so I guess part of the positive side of this too is that we know that reverses as well when you stop doing the behavior. Studies have shown that it takes about 4 years. When you look at the brain of someone who's recovered and stopped the substance, their brain looks the same and functions the same as someone who's never been addicted to that substance in the first place.
Wow. Do you mean that their prefrontal cortex can actually grow back? Is that what
Well,
they're looking for in the
I don't know
scans?
if grow back is, it's more about the pathways. So it's being used again, basically.
Okay.
It's active.
I'm thinking back to a paper I wrote on antisocial personality disorder, but there's an overwhelming connection between children who have been abused, violently abused, physically abused, and their prefrontal cortex actually doesn't grow properly. So then does that become a precursor for severe addiction?
Yeah. So I think, there's always back to the nature nurture kind of debate, which is really not a debate. I think most people understand it's both, right? So there is good evidences of like genetic predisposition for addictions, for example.
What does that mean?
Yeah, it just means that if you take, let's say two people, one's more predisposed for a certain kind of addiction and the other's less predisposed to it, then given the same circumstances, the one who is more predisposed are more likely to have gone into that down that path than the other. So it's people don't like hearing stuff like that because it sounds like predeterminism.
Exactly.
Right. But it doesn't necessarily, it's statistics, right? It doesn't necessarily mean that you're doomed to failure. It just means that you have more of a weakness for certain things over other people. So how you live that out can still be up to you. Like you still need to make choices. But then there's the nurture aspect, right? And that's where the environmental cues come in. Growing up in your dad and your uncle and your aunt and everyone else around you is doing the same thing, that's what and then you're very much more likely to fall into the same patterns than if someone grew up not in the same environment.
Yeah, I find it hard to accept that addiction's like hereditary, the same as diabetes or cancer or something. I'm just really curious about the studies behind that.
Yeah, you kind of have to take it with a grain of salt, I guess, because again, what comes first, nature or nurture? If you have people who are really addicted to something and then they also hang out with other people who are really addicted to it, and then they have children together, then it's almost like a form of selection happening there, so that there's that predisposition going on. You can see this across the board for so many things about us. Our genetics actually make up so much of who we are, more than we think, because even your range of how happy you can be is different for different people. Some people are predisposed to just not be as happy, but they have a range. So we want to help that person to reach the upper limit of that range for them. But in general, they might just not be as happy as someone who's more predisposed for happiness, for example.
Yeah. I think I would push back too and say that like cultural factors, such as like if you are raised in a culture where you're not fed nutritious foods and all the people around you are not, and your family hasn't had nutritious foods, like there are chemical compounds in food that can actually affect your genetic makeup as well.
Yeah.
Right. So then that can play into it as well.
Right. And I think this is a lot of new stuff that's coming out that you hear about. I don't know too much about it, to be honest, right? But like the idea of how certain genetic markers can be turned on or off based on things like nutrition or behavior even.
Yeah, so that's where I would push back on like the predeterminism kind of like, oh, well, my grandpa had addiction and my father had addiction, therefore it's in my genes. I think it's very complex. Yeah. That's what I'm saying. So, whether it was societal, whether there's trends of abuse and that has affected the prefrontal cortex and the makeup of your brain.
Right. I think the point of that is to talk about how difficult this is, right?
Exactly.
And how much more complex it is than just my morality or willpower. And yet we're not saying that because of that, there's no hope, because we know there is. We know that you can be put in the right environments, you can be given the right tools, and you can be making the right choices. And that reverses things. Right?
Exactly. Yeah. And just because there's a genetic disposition, it doesn't mean that has to be actualized. It doesn't have to come to fruition, right? Someone can have a genetic disposition for diabetes, let's say again, and through diet, they can manage that, right? Like there's ways that they can be aware of that disposition, but then address it so that it doesn't become their reality because it's not what they want for themselves and for their lives. Let's talk about stigma and how people view addiction. You kind of touched on how it's not an issue of morality necessarily. How does society in general, or how do people approach addiction?
Well, that's hard to say because we are in such a polarized society now, because then you would have this sides that would maybe make names to call a group of people who who are on addictions. And then you might have the other side who is very understanding of it, and maybe to a fault, to a point where it's like normalizing it or making it acceptable maybe. And when you speak publicly like you do on a podcast, we have to be so careful all of a sudden to dance around and not step on any toes and yet be truthful about, I think, the reality. And reality is always just more messy than any camp of thought can really capture.
It's a very political issue. We're definitely not going to get into the politics of it today, but just like a deeper understanding of the complexities of how society and stigma play a part in addiction, and even factors like, I remember at one point studying people who are incarcerated, and one gentleman was talking about how all of the people who are incarcerated, they're not criminals, they're just unhealthy, right? And he was looking at how a lot of people are coming from communities or urban centers where there's actual food deserts happening, right? They might live in the middle of a city, and because of the crime rate, all the grocery stores have moved out to the suburbs, and all the food they can find is fast food, and it's the only thing that's affordable. And sometimes there's bigger pieces at play about how the world is working, and how that's playing into the nature of addiction and how people end up very deeply addicted.
Yeah, and I think, I mean, again, not being political, but I think that that's where you can see some of the merits of the two sides of it. One side might say there's a environmental disadvantage, and that's why we need extra grace, we need extra help, we need extra understanding. And the other side is saying, what about personal responsibility? And I think that both needs to be taken into account, right? And I think most people know that. The middle, the vast majority of people actually can see that both of those things are important.
Politics usually surround homelessness and addiction, which we're not necessarily going there today. Like, most of our clientele is actually middle to upper class, housed individuals who are also facing addiction. And so I think part of what we're trying to do today is break down the stigma and realize that addiction can happen to anyone at any point in their life. And that's what we see coming into our office, right? You have people who have it all together and, have wealth and family and all the right things, and yet the addiction can still happen. So can you talk to that a little bit?
Yeah, well, I mean, just as I was thinking about the environmental things, as you mentioned, I didn't really look into the study myself. It was just a TED Talk, but you can see the rise of anxiety, depression among youth with a graph of the rise of the sales of iPhones.
Exactly.
Right? So, like, we have just different kinds of addictions that are happening in the middle class, upper class households, right? Not to mention that there are substances in all of the different stratas. Right? I'm thinking about our city and practices in Barrie, and a lot of it is commuters who work in Toronto and bought houses here because they were once upon a time more affordable. And so you have a lot of latchkey kids, which creates, again, another environment, right? Like, it's just a vacuum of being able to spend time as a family together, and left to my own devices, and boredom, and unlimited access to everything on the internet. We are in situations environmentally like it's ripe for addictions to happen.
Exactly. And a lot of the addiction that we're dealing with is actually technology. It's addiction to our smartphones. It's addiction to the internet. I mean, porn addiction, shopping addiction, eating addiction, gambling addiction. There's so many different kinds of addiction that we're seeing. It's not just substances. What would you say is the most common thing that you're seeing among your clients?
I mean, it's rare that I get the substance side of things. It does happen. If it is, it's normally drinking. Not a lot of people really want to address either smoking or marijuana as much, but it's mostly the drinking piece. And then, I mean, an interesting way of looking at anger is that anger is a bit of an addiction too, because there is a dopamine rush there when you're expressing anger. And then there's definitely the pornography side of things. Again, very rarely I've had eating addiction, but that has been a thing before too.
Some of that's just our office too, right? I think that if people are hooked on hard drugs, they're not necessarily coming to us for it, but there are avenues that cater to that more than we do. We don't necessarily advertise for it.
Yeah, like, I'm addicted to lying, and why am I such a compulsive liar? Like, those are some of the things I might hear too. So a lot of it is behavioral.
Yeah, a few of our team members have people who are addicted to, like, cutting, right? Self-harm. That's, again, a dopamine rush. It's a release of pain in a sense.
Yeah, pain and pleasure is very highly tied together. I mean, they're almost the same pathways.
Yeah, so I want to backtrack a little bit to the reasons that people get addicted, or why is it that that dopamine rush is so important to us or attractive to us, or why are we so hooked on dopamine?
Yeah. I mean, again, I'm not like a biochemist, right? So I don't really understand that part as much. But I guess the point, though, is that it's so powerful. Not only that, though, it's that, the true markers of a real addiction is that you started off wanting it and then you ended up needing it. A lot of times, it doesn't even bring you the same kind of pleasure anymore. And so that's where the confusion comes in with it, where people are like, why do I keep doing this thing? Like, I know I don't get anything from it, but why do I keep doing it? And it becomes automatic even, right?
Why do they keep doing it?
I think I love this illustration I read from a book. It's like, the feeling you get when you take off really tight shoes. It's like, that feels nice. Okay, so it's a relief. And so because of that sensation, I just keep putting tight shoes back on so that I can keep feeling the relief when I take it off, right? If I were instead to stop putting tight shoes on, then eventually I just don't find that I need it anymore. So yeah, it's that pent up energy of needing to release, I think. That's what people are looking for. That's where the searching behavior comes in when you are feeling it. It's like, I can't stop thinking about it. I'm thinking about how, or I'm gonna, like, a lot of it happens really quickly in your mind too. So you're like, or I'm tired, and all of a sudden I'm already thinking about 10 ways I'm gonna go and do that thing or find that thing, right?
Yeah.
And then it's like you're fighting it, and it's just like, it's tiring to fight it. So I'm just gonna let it go. And momentarily I don't have to feel that pressure. Right. So I think that's a lot of why there's that drive to go for it.
Yeah. So in a way, in some sense, it's kind of like scratching an itch, but in another sense, it's almost like an escape or a release or a sense of freedom almost when you're past the point where that thing feels good and now it's just nagging at you.
I think an itch is a really, really great analogy for it, because I have awful eczema sometimes, and everyone knows you're not supposed to itch because it makes it inflamed and worse. And yet it's painful and feels so good when you do. And then the moment you do, you're like now stuck in the cycle of, now it's going to be more inflamed and more itchy. And so you need to go for another itch. So like the best way is really to not itch it, but it's so almost nearly impossible not to.
Yeah. So I guess that's why the cops come through school in grade 7 and tell you don't do drugs. Like, don't try it, right? Because when you start experimenting with things, especially substances, at the start, it might feel good, but then, it becomes such a downward spiral into addiction, right?
Yeah, I think this is a cool thought experiment. Is anyone with an addiction, if you ask them, if you could go back in time to you right before you started, would you tell them to stop?
Yeah.
And everyone would be like, yeah, why would I have even started, right? Yeah.
I've seen studies on porn addiction too. And a lot of times it's a young kid that by accident has come across pornographic material, or their friend showed them when they're, 8, 9, 10 years old. And they're not prepared to deal with it at that age. But then they're curious about it. So then, it's just like, oh, I'm just going to watch it one more time. Like, it feels wrong, but something about it feels good in a way.
Yeah.
And then over time, that becomes an addictive cycle and very, very hard to break out of.
Yeah. Forbidden fruit is sweet. Porn is something that is so pervasive that is almost taken for granted that any guy now is addicted to it, because it's so easily accessible, and because we have phones, you can find it anywhere because people have phones with them at all times now. So you have like unlimited access to a world of images that trigger your neurotransmitters.
Yeah.
And so I'm bored, oh, porn. I feel stressed, porn. I'm angry, porn. So it's a release, right? It's like a momentary release and escape from reality. And life is hard. Life is difficult, and that's why there's a temptation for fantasy to escape from reality for momentarily. And there's like good spaces for that, I think. But then you want to find healthy ways to do that, and these are like the quick ways that unfortunately is so available.
Yeah, I heard someone say once that porn is the wallpaper of the world, right? It's just like so available. But I think that kind of highlights the way that all addictive substances are everywhere, right? And in a way, we're almost prey to it, because people that are producing porn, people that are producing cell phones, they want us to be hooked on it because it's driving their business, right? People that are producing, I don't know, pop, like sugary foods and beverages that are terrible for us. It's plastered everywhere. It's available at every checkout of every grocery store because they know that we're hooked on it and that's how they're going to make another buck, right? So, I mean, in what sense are we just prey to the system and capitalism? And how is that feeding our addictiveness?
Yeah, well, when you put it that way, it sounds, I mean, it feels like, and I think a lot of people feel this way, like this oppressive monstrosity that is all around us. And so when we're faced with that, then what is our response, right? The easiest thing is to lay down and just let it happen to me. I guess it takes intentionality to create a lifestyle or environment around me that is counter to the system in some ways. And there's good influences out there for that, right? Like, you know, people are really into fitness now, for example. And that's great. That's like a really, I mean, all good things can go too far, but like that's like a really good trend. Like people tout social connection and going out for walks and like all these good alternatives that gives you healthy, good, slow dopamine releases instead of the hits, right?
Yeah. And I've heard 20-year-olds say they want to burn their phone. They hate that it's got so much control.
Yeah. Right. You have a trend of young people who are like trying to go back to, you know, baking sourdough bread, right? and finding the pleasure of making something and enjoying it. I think it's such a cool counter trend, right?
Yeah. It's refreshing. I hope it catches. And I mean, we're not here to say that sugar's all bad or the technology's all bad, but I think it's just the part where it's like pressed on us and forced on us in a sense that, you know, people that are addicted, for someone who's addicted, it's very, very hard to come out from that and, you know, not be triggered all the time.
Yeah, it's the famous story of the mice that are addicted. You know the one I'm talking about.
I'm thinking of the one from Catch Me If You Can, the one that turned the cream into butter.
No, not that one.
Not that one.
No, the one where they experimented. They had mice who were lacing their drinks with cocaine. So the mice are now addicted. They would just keep coming back to the bottle and drinking it until they die. So they give these rats a rat paradise. You know, lots of space to run and play, lots of social connection with other rats. And so these rats were happily living off their lives without coming back to the substance because the environment changed.
Yeah, I think that's called, is that one Ratopia? It's in Denmark, I think. Yeah, that's actually a very popular study. And especially people that are kind of pushing back against a harm reduction model, right? This is like an alternative to that that's still positive that people are curious about right now.
Okay, so one thing we need to recognize about the addiction cycle is that it is in some ways systemic in your life, right? There's systems being built all the time. And we love homeostasis. We love the status quo. So change is difficult for everyone. And that's why you see when there's families that has a person with an addiction, they actually build systems around that. They don't like it, but they've built systems to cope with it. And so if a system has been in place for long enough, it becomes very jarring or people don't really understand it when there's a change all of a sudden. So like you can get a dad, for example, who's an alcoholic. And so everyone learned how to, you know, tiptoe around that, just the way that they interact around each other and with the person who is drunk. And then all of a sudden that goes to rehab and comes back and is sober and nobody knows how to deal with it. And so people might not even know it, but subconsciously they're already starting to push drinks towards him to bring it back to the status quo.
Yeah.
To bring things back to how it used to be. And so there needs to be an awareness of that. It's not always just the individual that needs to change, but the whole system that needs to change.
Yeah. Or I'm thinking about kids with iPads and, you know, parents that keep shoving an iPad in their kid's hand and the kid is so addicted to that screen that this has become our model of discipline. This has become our model of raising our child is that it's a reward system based on getting more screen time.
Yeah, it's kind of a funny thing. It's almost like a collective addiction. Because I'm thinking about this documentary I watched when I was in my undergrad. And it was this man who was wildly overweight. He was 400 pounds, couldn't move, can't even get out of bed. And the whole time the documentary team was interviewing and taking videos. And so the mom and the sister were just weeping while they were prepping this massive feast for him. And then they would put it in front of him, this huge spread to show him how much he eats in one day. And he just shrugs his shoulders and starts eating the moment he sees it. and everyone's weeping. And yet the man literally can't get out of bed to make food for himself. And so the mom and sisters are,
they're feeding it, right?
and they're blind to it.
Yeah.
Right. Because the system has been there for so long, however it started. Maybe it was to stop him from screaming. Right. And then now it's just become a part of their system and their routine, their life.
Yeah.
And so they're feeding him to death, but literally, buying the food and cooking the food and bringing it to his room, right? Like over and over again while weeping about it.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think when you're in a system, and when anyone in the whole system is in a system, they don't know it. They're blind to it unless they're coming in from as an outsider.
Yeah, and I think that highlights the nature versus nurture again too, right? Because sometimes we might find ourselves addicted and it might be related to how our parents had anxiety and couldn't handle us screaming when we were kids and we just got fed candies all the time or passed the iPad, right? So like sometimes that addictive nature shows up from a very young age and it's something outside of our control. And I mean, addiction is outside our control. That's the whole idea of this, right? But also, I think we're just trying to reduce the shame and stigma around addiction. Just recognizing that there's so many factors playing into it. Besides our own disposition, there's also society pressing in on us. There's our upbringing, there's our culture, right? There's so many factors at play that we need to approach this with so much compassion and such a desire to see people heal and change, which is possible, right?
Yeah, I think it's always the both and approach of compassion and understanding for how things came to be, but then caring enough that wanting you to not continue to go down that road.
Yeah, exactly. We're not trying to just pat people on the back and soothe the addiction. Like we want to see people get better and get out of it. That's where the neuropathways research is so promising and hopeful, is that we're actually capable of overcoming our addiction and moving beyond it and living past it and looking back on it later and saying, I used to be addicted. I'm not anymore. I think that's just so amazing. Lindsay, thanks for coming in. If you'll join us for part 2 of the series, we're going to talk about treatment of addiction, what we do with clients during sessions, what kind of modalities we use, and success stories of people breaking free and moving on. This is Beyond the Session, brought to you by Reset Counseling and Psychotherapy in Barrie, Ontario. If you have any questions about what you heard on the show, or if you just want to say hi, you can email us at resetbarrie@gmail.com, and we'll hope to see you next time.